September 14th, 1812, Moscow. A man in a gray overcoat stands at the window of the Kremlin, watching the largest city in Russia burn. The flames climb 300 feet into a blood-orange sky. Ash falls like snow on the cobblestones below. 600,000 soldiers, the largest army Europe has ever assembled, wait for his next order. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. He is 43 years old. He has crowned himself Emperor of the French, rewritten the laws of a continent, and humbled every monarch from Madrid to Warsaw. In 3 years, he will be a prisoner on a rock in the South Atlantic. How does a man who conquered Europe lose everything in 1,000 days? The answer begins in the snow. To understand the fall, you must first understand the height. By 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte ruled, directly or by proxy, an empire of more than 80 million people. The French tricolor flew over Amsterdam, Hamburg, Rome, and Barcelona. His brothers sat on the thrones of Spain, Westphalia, and Naples. The map of Europe had been redrawn in his handwriting. He had won at Austerlitz against 2 emperors. He had crushed Prussia at Jena in a single afternoon. The German philosopher Hegel, watching him ride through Jena, called him the world soul on horseback. Marshal Ney called him the god of war. But gods, history reminds us, fall hardest. By 1812, 3 structural cracks had begun to spread beneath the marble of the empire. Spain bled him slowly. The continental system was suffocating his own allies. And in the east, a czar who had once embraced him had quietly stopped obeying. Napoleon had a solution. He always did. He would march on Moscow. On June 24th, 1812, 685,000 soldiers crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. It was the largest invasion force in human history to that point. 20 nationalities marched under French eagles. 1,200 cannon rolled behind them. Napoleon expected a battle within weeks, a swift, decisive blow, the kind that had broken Austria and Prussia. Instead, the Russian armies under Barclay de Tolly retreated, and retreated, and retreated. They burned the wheat in the fields. They poisoned the wells. They emptied the villages. The Grande Armée marched into a vacuum. By the time Napoleon reached Borodino on September 7th, his army had already lost 1/3 of its men, not to combat, but to dysentery, starvation, and the simple exhaustion of marching 700 miles into nothing. Borodino itself was a slaughter without precedent, 70,000 casualties in a single day. A French officer wrote in his diary that night, "The dead lay in heaps so high that the wounded suffocated beneath them." Napoleon won the field. The Russians withdrew in order. It was the worst kind of victory. 1 week later, he entered Moscow. The city was empty. That night it began to burn, set alight by most accounts on the orders of its own governor, Count Rostopchin. For 5 weeks, Napoleon waited in the smoldering ruins for a peace offer that never came. Tsar Alexander, safe in St. Petersburg, sent no reply. On October 19th, Napoleon ordered the retreat. The temperature fell to -30. Horses froze standing up. Men ate the horses. When the horses were gone, they ate the leather of their own boots. Cossacks struck the column at dawn and at dusk, every day for 6 weeks. At the crossing of the Berezina River in late November, 20,000 soldiers and camp followers died in a single afternoon. Some shot, some drowned, most simply trampled into the ice. Of the 685,000 who crossed the Niemen in June, fewer than 100,000 limped back across it in December. The Imperial Guard, the unkillable, had been gutted. The myth of invincibility died in the Russian snow. Napoleon returned to Paris alone, in a sleigh in disguise. Within 90 days, he had raised another army, 300,000 conscripts, most of them teenagers. Veterans called them the Marie-Louise, after the empress whose name appeared on their draft notices. But Europe had read the casualty lists. In March 1813, Prussia declared war. Then Sweden. Then in August, Austria, his own father-in-law, Emperor Francis, turned against him. For the first time, the great powers of Europe were united against a single man. They had learned painfully how to fight him. Never engage Napoleon directly, always attack his marshals. Wear down the army he could no longer replace. The strategy worked. On October 16, 1813, near the Saxon city of Leipzig, 600,000 soldiers met in what Europeans would call the Battle of the Nations. It lasted 4 days. It was the largest battle in European history until the First World War. When the smoke cleared, Napoleon had lost 70,000 men, his German allies had switched sides mid-battle, and the road back to France lay open to his enemies. A young Saxon soldier wrote home, "The Emperor rode past us at sunset. He did not look at the dead. I think he could no longer bear to." Leipzig was not a defeat, it was a verdict. By January 1814, foreign armies stood on French soil for the first time in 20 years. Napoleon, with 70,000 exhausted men, fought what military historians still call his most brilliant campaign. 6 victories in 9 days against forces 3 times his size. It was not enough. On March 31st, the Russians and Prussians entered Paris. His own marshals, Ney, Berthier, Lefebvre, confronted him at Fontainebleau and refused to march again. "The army will not obey you," Ney told him. "The army obeys its chiefs." On April 6, 1814, Napoleon signed his abdication. He tried to poison himself that night with a vial he had carried since Russia. The poison had lost its strength. He vomited and lived. The victors were generous, or perhaps merely careless. They gave him the island of Elba, 12 miles off the coast of Tuscany, 86 square miles of olive trees and iron mines, and the title of Emperor of a population of 12,000. He spent 10 months there. He reorganized the island's administration. He planted gardens. He read the French newspapers, which arrived weeks late, and watched as the restored Bourbon king alienated the army, the peasants, and the bourgeoisie in turn. Then on February 26, 1815, he boarded a small ship called the Inconstant with 1,100 men and sailed for France. He landed near Caen. He walked north. At Grenoble, a regiment sent to arrest him opened its ranks and joined him instead. At Lyon, the cavalry deserted to his side. On March 20th, he entered the Tuileries in Paris on the shoulders of his old soldiers. The Bourbon king had fled the night before, leaving his dinner uneaten on the table. Not a shot had been fired, but Europe would not negotiate. Within days, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia declared him an outlaw, not a sovereign, but a criminal, and pledged 1 million men to bring him down. He moved first. On June 15, 1815, he crossed into Belgium with 120,000 veterans, intending to crush the British and Prussian armies separately before they could combine. 3 days later, on a rain-soaked ridge near a Belgian village called Waterloo, the wheel of European history turned for the last time. Wellington held the ridge. Napoleon attacked and attacked and attacked again. Hougomont, La Haye Sainte, the great cavalry charges of Marshal Ney into the British squares. For 10 hours, the outcome trembled. Then at 7 in the evening, the Prussians under Blücher, whom Napoleon had believed beaten, emerged from the woods on his right flank. The Imperial Guard, sent forward in a last desperate assault, broke for the first time in its history. A cry went up across the French line. La Garde recule. The Guard is retreating. The army dissolved. 47,000 men lay dead or wounded on a field 2 miles wide. A British officer wrote that night, "I had never till that day known what it was to be heartily sick of war." 4 days later in Paris, Napoleon abdicated for the second and final time. Was the fall inevitable? In the cold light of history, yes. France in 1812 had 30 million people. The coalition arrayed against him commanded more than 170 million. Britain's industry and navy made his continental system a slow strangulation of his own economy, not Britain's. Napoleon had built a system that depended entirely on his own infallibility. His foreign minister, Talleyrand, wrote in 1808, "He will destroy himself. It is only a question of when." He had been warned by his ambassador Caulaincourt, by his own generals, by the maps themselves. He marched anyway. His genius was his engine. It was also his cliff. He was sent to St. Helena, a volcanic rock 1,200 miles from the nearest continent. He lived there 5 years and 7 months, in a damp farmhouse called Longwood. He died on May 5, 1821, of stomach cancer, hastened by despair. He was 51. His final word, witnesses said, was Josephine. Between 1803 and 1815, the Napoleonic Wars killed between 3 and 6 million people. Every village in France has a square named for him. Almost every village in France lost sons because of him. There is a painting by Paul Delaroche. It shows Napoleon alone at his desk at Fontainebleau, the night before his first abdication. The candles have burned low. He is not yet defeated. He is something quieter and worse. He is finished. The fall of Napoleon is the older, sadder story of a man who could not imagine a limit to himself. 200 years later, the same temptation still calls. The belief that genius substitutes for arithmetic, that will substitutes for resources, that this time somehow the snow will not fall. The snow always falls.